Welcome, class. This channel is called the Instruction Manual, a channel for teachers, administrators, and anyone who loves to learn about, well, learning. Whether your classroom is IRL or virtual, we have tons of tips and tricks to make your teaching experience fun, unique, and dare we say it, easy. For today's schedule, we'll have a brief history lesson covering the teaching style of the philosopher Socrates. Next, we will look at how the Socratic method is used in modern classrooms and ways to improve the technique in your own classroom. And finally, the class will end with a session on ages and stages, where we look at how the Socratic method can be used with specific age groups. Before we begin, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe for the video. Click the bell to be notified for future video posts. Socrates is easily one of the most recognizable names in education. His technique, known as the Socratic method, is still used regularly in top-tier universities, law schools, and even in Supreme Court sessions. But to call Socrates a teacher may be a stretch by today's standards. To see why, let's turn our pages to a brief history lesson. To explain Socrates from today's perspective, I'll introduce you to my favorite 6th grade teacher, Mr. Branch. If Mr. Branch were to teach like Socrates, he would never be caught dead in a classroom or even behind lecture podiums. Instead, Mr. Branch would dress in less than pristine clothing. Think of an extreme bohemian look. He would also roam the streets of a major city on foot, searching everywhere for people known to speak their minds about hot topics of the day. Once Mr. Branch discovers his victim, or student, he would then deploy a most diabolical weapon. Questions. A lot of questions, like all the questions. These aren't meant to test things that can be proved with the naked eye. If someone said the grass is green or that water is wet, then Mr. Branch can abide things that come with physical evidence. But if someone were to give an opinion, a belief based on ethics, political leanings, or worse, a commonly held prejudice, then that is when Mr. Branch pounces. He will continue to ask question after question after question, until in some cases, the student becomes so flustered they are either reduced to tears or incensed with rage. But oddly enough, this teaching method makes Mr. Branch insanely popular. People from far and wide would seek out Mr. Branch, invite him into their homes, and even pay him to repeat the process.
Thank you, Mr. Branch, for that excellent demonstration.
No problem, Socrates. Is it true that you became known through all of Athens for your teaching style?
Well, it wasn't really a teaching style, but politicians, generals, and playwrights would adopt and use my dialogue method for centuries after. You may have even heard of some of my students, such as Plato, the philosopher who authored the Republic.
To think someone can become so profound to education just from asking questions.
I never asked a question for its own sake. My style of dialogue came from something much more intuitive. My questions were always patented to understand as much as I could about a person's unique perspective. That made the learning process an extremely personalized experience.
But that means that no one really received the same type of learning experience with your method.
Although the questions were patented for the individual, I never allowed my pupils to give an answer without thorough examination or without specific definitions. The questions may not have been similar to each other, but every student must have approached the questions with the same expectations.
I think I understand. Even in my time, most students give answers that are memorized from outside sources. Textbooks and certain information sources rarely allow students to examine things like definitions or factual phrases.
Correct. I made students consider the definitions of common terms, even when these were solely based on a student's personal experience. This made a student's life experience just as valid to the lesson as any information from a book. The student can then feel confident in offering their point of view no matter their background.
But what about the viewpoint of the teacher? My role as the instructor is to guide students towards the correct viewpoint. If a student's perspective equals that of books or even a teacher, how can learning really take place?
A teacher is often perceived as a source of knowledge, much like a book. A student is very often seen as an empty cup or page. Normally, a teacher's role is to fill a student's mind with knowledge, since the teacher is given the status of an expert on any given subject. In this case, a teacher must then have the right answer to every question. But the key to understand my method is to undermine the idea that any one person can master knowledge. I'm even quoted as saying, "The only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing." With this in mind, a teacher may see themselves as a guide in education instead of a master. If a teacher and student explore knowledge on an equal footing, Then both can become invested in attaining knowledge that is free of bias.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think it's time we take all this equal footing back into the classroom. But before that, don't forget to take time to like this video. And if you want the instruction manual to cover lesson ideas for your classroom, don't forget to leave a comment down below. We said that the Socratic method is one of the most pervasive teaching strategies in history, but how exactly is it used in today's classroom? Classic Socratic method relies on traditional read and recall practice. A student reads text to memorize specific information. A teacher asks the student to recall that information from memory. Traditionally, the Socratic method extends that read and recall practice by adding discussion time. The discussion is driven by questions asked by the teacher who acts as a moderator. The questions should use recalled information as a launching point for rhetorical or hypothetical scenarios. And no, Socratic questions don't have to be pigeonholed into subjects like the humanities or social sciences. Questions can be adapted for covering any subject as long as they are used to drive discussion. You can also use the Socratic method in many different formats. You can have Socratic discussion one-on-one with a student or among small groups. It may help to practice this way so that you and your students can get comfortable with the lesson format. Most importantly, you can have Socratic discussion without relying on textbooks or printouts. Let's not forget that Socrates lived in a time before textbooks, so feel comfortable allowing your students to use their own experiences and personal skills during discussions. Imagine watching your students connect what they learn with their own lives. Suddenly, it's easy to see why Socrates was so popular. All right, class, time to break for our final session. Ages and stages. First up is K through 3, or kindergarten through 3rd grade.
Excuse me, may I step in, please?
Would you like to tag in for this session, Socrates? All right, let's see what you've got.
It may seem strange to attempt Socratic dialogue with small children, but remember, holding classroom discussions teach more than just a day's subject. Discussion can be used to teach elements of discourse, such as taking turns, speaking politely, and citing evidence to make a point. Allow answers that pertain to the topic even if they sound silly. Let a goal of the lesson be to build confidence in their ability to speak freely among their peers. For younger age groups, teachers should create small time intervals of 10 to 15 minutes for discussion. Most important, the topic of conversation should revolve around a physical object, one that provides as much sensory feedback as possible for the students. This can be easily achieved with scientific topics like botany or geology. Even math can be discussed using things like beads or Legos for counting and discussing word problems. 3rd through 6th grade students are still an elementary age group. Persist in using physical objects for class discussions and in using brief time intervals. Try to steer away from use of textbooks or worksheets until you feel confident that your students are adept at understanding abstract or hypothetical concepts. When discussing rhetorical subjects, try to refer to things familiar to the students, such as family life or interactions with friends. Teachers can experiment with different discussion formats. Let students practice writing answers or observations before sharing their thoughts either in small groups or individually. Allow students to compare answers amongst themselves and attempt coming to a consensus before sharing answers with the class. Notice here we are practicing the use of making textual references, but still using a student's personal experience and ideas to build confidence and practice polite interactions with others. At the secondary level, my Socratic method is traditionally used for assessment purposes. This is done by assigning reading or studying the night before. Then a teacher will ask questions at a rapid pace for students to answer. Books or notes can be used for reference. Memorized answers are then examined during class discussion with the teacher taking the role of the moderator. This method is very popular, but can often make students feel pressured to perfectly memorize answers. The emphasis of the discussion is not the practice of discourse, but upon the perception that only one answer is relevant to any question. Remember that Socratic discussion is meant to disprove the existence of absolute knowledge and to rely on differing perspectives to find a common answer or truth. Socratic dialogue does not have to be used for testing purposes. It's best to use the method to practice discussion techniques and learn the importance of another's perspective. Let students practice in pairs or small groups until they are adept at sharing in discussions. Even better, introduce a topic in which you, the teacher, have little expertise or knowledge. Work with your students as their equal when searching for common understanding of the subject. Remember to model appropriate methods of discussion and how to table adverse opinions with well-researched evidence.
Thank you, Socrates, for all your wisdom today. For today's homework, explore more ideas on how to use Socratic dialogue in your classroom. You can start by using our Supreme Court lesson plan posted to our Patreon. You can find exclusive videos for creating a self-motivated classroom, curriculum maps, and more from the moment you join. Thanks for watching, and until next time, see you on the next page.